Rally Round the Cannon. Some thoughts on Princeton's history by somebody who should know better. Stanley Kelly Jr., our wonderful emeritus professor of politics, recently died. This brings back intense memories and feelings, and my usual problem recurs. I have a very difficult time to this day trying to explain that my undergraduate years were different. Now, everybody's undergraduate years are different. That's the whole point. Duh. But while the great and eventually unique class of 1970 walked into Princeton in a welter of chinos and loafers and manly clubs, we left in an aromatic haze with torn jeans and tie-dyed t-shirts and female clubmates. We entered the Princeton of Hobey Baker in the long drag kick line and in loco parentis, and left the Princeton of Brian Taylor and the CPUC and women's studies and the movement for a new Congress. I've always had an easy time believing in wormholes, because it always seemed to me Princeton took a gleeful skip from one side of the galaxy to the other, while I was down in the basement of Holder at WPRB, listening to the brand new Beatles, Stones, and Who albums. Astonishingly, a huge portion of this space-time transformation took place in a 14-month period from 1969 to 1970, barely a single leaf raking on the historic arc of the front campus. The Daily Princetonian of the time became as close to the stereotypical extra murder in the library B-movie police tabloids as it was to the New York Times, and students and faculty alike found satire to be futile since it couldn't keep up with reality. The horrendous national mess of 1968, featuring the Tet Offensive, Lyndon Johnson's implosion, Martin Luther King and Bobby Kennedy's assassinations, urban riots, the Chicago Democratic Convention, and the resurrection of Richard Nixon and the perpetuation of the Vietnam War, moved onto the campuses in 1969, just as questions of mission, rights, diversity, governance, and leadership all coalesced in a college generation that was beginning to suspect that Woodstock Nation was saner than any other on earth, and had no idea what to do about it. For a little context, here are just a few news items from the world at large between April 1969 and April 1970. Harvard President Nathan Pusey brought in the Cambridge police to oust demonstrators from his administration building. 45 people were injured. His credibility was destroyed. The Weathermen took over the National SDS structure, then sponsored the Days of Rage riots. Some of them blew themselves up by mistake in a New York townhouse. The Stonewall riots erupted, marking the beginning of the gay rights movement. Man landed and walked on the moon for the first time. The misnamed Woodstock Festival took place. President Nixon coined and slowly began Vietnamization, removing some American troops from Vietnam. 400,000 people demonstrated in Washington against the war while he watched football on TV. Spiro Agnew, possibly the most venal individual ever elected to American national office, began his divisive criticisms of the press and the left. The My Lai massacre was uncovered. The Chicago Seven went on trial, and 5 of them were imprisoned despite being acquitted of conspiracy. The first military draft lottery since World War II was held. The Beatles broke up, and Diana Ross left the Supremes. The first Earth Day took place too. Meanwhile, Fitzgerald's jazz-age Princeton had been steadily undermined by the Depression and World War II and Martin Luther King, but it took President Bob Goheen of the class of 40, Harold Helm of the class of 20, Stanley Kelly, and, of all unlikely people, Bob Dylan, to turn it into the Princeton we know today. The trustees started the ball rolling in April of 1969, literally faced with 2 stacks of envelopes addressed to female applicants, one saying, "We're not co-ed," and the other saying, "You're a Princetonian." The board bowed to Helms' Coeducation Committee report and admitted women undergrads effective in September. This would have been the single defining event of most decades. In 1969, it was just a momentary appetizer. The next month saw the election of Robert Cass of the class of '68 and senior Brent Henry of the class of '69 as university trustees, the first young alumni trustees under a hastily assembled new policy which outflanked a revolt against a prior rule requiring alumni to be 10 years out before eligibility. Oh, and Brent Henry was, and is, also black, another first in the university's 223 years of trustees. Next up to the plate in 1969, in May, was Stan Kelly. While his Committee on University Governments was continuing its work under the behest of the trustees, their first creation, the unprecedented Council of the Princeton University Community, or CPUC, was presented, approved, and slated to take effect as soon as most of its diverse members were elected by student, faculty, administration, staff, and alumni constituencies. The Council continues as the university's principal operating body to this day. In August, the single-wing offense was dropped by new football coach Jake McCandless of the class of '51, a combination trademark and talisman of the football program for 24 years under Charlie Caldwell of the class of '25 and then just retired Dick Coleman, wherein it went 145, 63, and 3 against some of the best teams in the country, with a Heisman and a couple Lambert trophies to show. Some football alums felt as if they'd lost a child. The first game in the new T formation exposed the unreadiness of the offensive change on national television, as Princeton lost the 100th anniversary game of college football to Rutgers, 29-zip. Later vindicated in the season's final game with a 35-7 thrashing of a powerful, undefeated Dartmouth team for the Ivy Co-Championship, the offensive change proved bittersweet. Princeton then went 20 years and 4 coaches before it saw another title. In the early fall of 1969, Whig Hall burned to the walls. Most Whig Clio records were saved, but the architecture of the rebuilding was a sore point for decades afterward. On November 19th, Pete Conrad of the class of 1953 walked on the surface of the moon. He literally carried the Princeton flag with him. Strangely, we on campus were closer to the event horizon of the wormhole than he was. Be sure to tune in next time when we hear Vietnam seep inexorably onto the campus and even the football field in 1969, and Walter Hickel, of all people, gets caught in the backdraft. Yours in virtual orange and black, this is Greg Lang of the great class of 1970. Rally Round the Cannon is a podcast from the Princeton Alumni Weekly online.